Hi everyone. I think you're joining in now, so thanks very much for joining us. We're going to wait a minute and then Adam and I are going to get started just so that people have a little bit of time to join. I can see names coming in, which is wonderful. So for those that just joined, we're gonna take off at 1 minute past the hour, just to give everyone a chance to join in. So for those who are joining us on these webinars for the first time, there is a Q&A function, so feel free to start asking questions. Adam and I will see them, and we'll kick off in 10 seconds. I think most people have joined from the looks of it. All right. So thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to this session. This is the Australian version of our webinars from a report that we wrote engaging with university CEOs and senior administrators across the world. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples as the custodians of the lands and waters of the Canberra region, which is where I'm joining you from, and pay respects to their descendants, both past and present. I know we're being joined by people from across the country, and I extend my respects to the custodians of country on which you join and ask you to do the same. So I'm joined today by Adam Gray. I'll get Adam to introduce himself in a moment. Adam's the CEO of Nous Data Insights. My name's Paul Taylor. I'm a principal with Nous Group. I lead our work on university administration and financial management around the world, and I'm also the lead author on this report. So this is the third report in our series of papers on the changing role of university CEOs. We started this series while I was in the Toronto office during COVID, as we saw this kind of changing dynamic of what it meant to be a university CEO. We wrote our first one at the end of 2021, talking about how the role had gone from more of an administrator to this sort of strategic risk manager for the institution, and moving more into the strategic partner for boards, for vice chancellors, etc. And then we've been following those CEOs for the last sort of 4 or 5 years now, and we re-engage with them. This year we got about 55 CEOs answer the call, so wonderful to have so many join us and talk about what that role looks like and what the university looks like in 2025 and beyond. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. And for those of you who've had the chance to read the report, you'll see financial sustainability risks that once appeared on the horizon are now a very urgent priority, and we'll spend some time on that. But before I do that, I'm delighted to be joined by Adam to give some context on the Australian, New Zealand, and Australasian universities that we engaged with. So I'll hand over to Adam to introduce himself.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everyone. As Paul said, my name is Adam Gray. I'm the CEO of Nous Data Insights. Up until recently, we were called Nous Cubane, and many of you will know us as the organisation that has run Unifor for 15 years, which has been sort of the world-leading program for providing benchmarking and analytics on professional services. As the name suggests, we are starting now to broaden out what it is we do as an institution, as an organisation, providing more data solutions for universities globally as part of the broader Nous Group proposition. And yes, very much looking forward to today talking about some of the themes that we've seen come through in this latest professional leaders service report. I think you'll find many of them will be resonating with what you're hearing within your institutions today. So yes, looking forward to stepping into that. I'll hand over back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Adam. So the way we're going to run today is Adam and I have sort of picked out a few of the key parts of the report that we thought were most interesting to talk about. Adam and I will sort of bounce back and forth, and then we have a Q&A function, and we'll work through all the questions that you ask. So feel free to ask them at any time as they pop up. Adam and I should, if it all works well, see them as we go. And if they are very good for us to answer at the time, great. But we'll also motivate you in the last 20 minutes in particular to answer lots of questions so we can spend some time in the Q&A. The first, I guess, insight from this survey that we did, which is on the screen for you all, is really the shifting sense from CEOs around previously. The conversations around financial sustainability were acute, and CEOs were saying it's coming. We're really going to have to make changes. This year, and in this study, it was more of a kind of urgency around it's either we haven't made the structural changes we needed to be sustainable, or we are right at the edge here. And so the title of the report is On the Precipice. For decades, I think, as many of you will know, universities across Australia, Canada, the UK, New Zealand in particular, operating in an environment where sustained expansion, particularly increasing student numbers, especially international student numbers, growing research ambitions, and also a steady rise in sort of capital and digital investments was the norm and was the strategy. Now, I think there are a number of institutions which are confronting this new era where rising costs, stagnant or declining revenues, and the global uncertainties around us are really forcing a genuine financial constraint, and therefore a question of what does the business model look like going forward. You'll see on the screen that while individual universities always face very different financial considerations, some being more insulated from the pressures than others, what we see is a major trend in this year of close to 60% of the universities and the CEOs we talked about seeing worse or significantly worse financial positions. And so, yes, that means there's sort of 43% that are not in that position. But what we see is that cost growth, that stagnant declining in revenues is really pushing the pressure onto CEOs and onto universities to think quite differently. Against that backdrop, many universities are sort of facing these urgent challenges and doing really substantial changes to balance those budgets, to strengthen their balance sheets, and to ensure long-term success. This requires universities to act in some sense more decisively and more quickly than has been happening in the last 5 years. And really, this report asks the question of, are universities set up well? Do CEOs think that they're set up well to be able to take on that radically different challenge? There are two parts to this conversation, and Adam and I are really going to focus on the short and medium term. There's also the bigger question of whether universities themselves need to rethink their sort of business model and what it looks like long term. But what we focused on today and what we think is really the sort of necessary and urgent action is thinking about what does the next 3 to 4 years look like to alleviate those financial pressures and have the courage to do the sort of reforms that have been talked about for a long time but haven't yet happened. So the report has 6 themes, which I've popped up there. I guess they're in sort of 3 columns. Really, one is about what does it look like to lead in this changing sector. Then the second is what does it actually look like to achieve the kind of institution-wide reforms that have been talked about but haven't been actioned in full or in part by many. And the last is really about anticipating the change and disruption that's coming. And so we'll finish with the conversation around what does it look like to invest, particularly taking on sort of physical assets and also digital assets and AI as part of that sort of digital future as well. Adam and I are going to tag team. And so what I'll do is I'll hand over to Adam to take us through this first theme, which is we've titled Steering the Ship.
Thanks very much, Paul. And look, so as Paul was saying, ANZ universities, for really the second time this decade, find themselves in, again, an unprecedented financial situation. I was talking to a CEO recently who said they're actually trying to ban the word unprecedented because they're sort of sick of it being used around the university, but it's true. The fundamental assumptions that universities, that have underpinned the growth of universities over the last 15 to 20 years, those have changed. And some would argue that they're unlikely to sort of go back again. So things like the way in which domestic enrolments are being funded, what's happening in international markets, what's happening around the cost of delivery, those things are unlikely to sort of reverse. So it's not then surprising to see, as you can see here on this first chart under the theme of steering the ship, that one of the most important area that's come up for professional service leaders in the next 5 years is around leading transformational change. The issues facing universities are very much structural in nature. So if you compare this to where we were a couple of years ago during COVID, where it was more of an acute crisis, many universities enacted quite sort of fast cost takeout responses at that time. We have seen a lot of that then come back as revenues and the workers come back as well, a lot of that cost. But this time we're talking about more structural long-term changes in the way universities are funded, in the way that their cost base is evolving. So that's why, again, it's not surprising to see that universities and professional services leaders are thinking about this as, this is no longer just where can I take cost out? This is, I need to now be thinking about more structurally, how is it that I'm changing? I need to change the institution. And what that's doing for, particularly for COOs and professional services leaders, is that is both increasing their remit and sort of very much putting them in the spotlight as well. So professional services leaders, they will often hold many of the different leaders that, the levers that's required to take cost out. But then that's also sort of exposing them to a lot sort of larger risks as well. I was actually in the UK quite recently at a conference, and there was a managing director from one of the banks there was talking about the issues around financials hitting UK universities and just how many universities are now operating as an ongoing concern, and the risk that that then puts onto CFOs, COOs, councils, and the like. So the risks are much higher. What it's also requiring of COOs and professional services leaders is, this is a much larger scale of transformation effort. So there does need to be a much sort of broader acknowledgement and co-leadership of this problem. So this is where we're seeing a lot more COOs recognizing that this is a problem that is, a problem shared is a problem halved. So they need to be collaborating much more across institutions. And Paul will talk about this a little bit more in some follow-on themes around how we see that collaboration both across the sector and within institutions as being a much stronger focus for universities going forward. But one of the interesting things that did actually come through this report and the survey is, when thinking about that co-leadership, one challenge that professional service leaders have identified is the issue around what we call sort of financial literacy, or sort of a gap between what the executives see as the sort of the financial challenges facing the institution and what the broader community would be seeing. So again, it's very different to what it was a couple of years ago when we had COVID. There was a very obvious sort of issue that was impacting the financials of universities. Now, a lot of these more structural changes, they're more insidious in nature. So it is hard for a lot of the community to see that. So a big focus for a lot of COOs, CFOs at the moment with institutions is very much around how do you make the financials better understood and more transparent, and a bigger part of the decision-making process. So that's sort of one of the big things that we've really heard COOs talking more about through this particular survey. The last thing I want to sort of quickly talk about here is this idea of balancing the short term and the long term. So this is something that sort of Paul touched on before. And again, it's an interesting theme. Particularly, we saw this come through here in Australia around this idea, although you can see there's a Canadian quote there, similar issue, is that a lot of these sort of acute financial problems that are playing out now is directing a lot of attention towards the here and now rather than the longer term. And we had a conference actually in the UK recently where we talked about this idea around, so how do you balance those two sort of the tensions around managing the financial viability and operations on a day-to-day versus actually carving out enough time to be thinking about the more strategic long-term issues and where the institution needs to be going. And the idea of, it's an old term from a few years ago now, but the idea of the ambidextrous leader came back again. So that leader who can be both sort of managing, who's the change champion and can be leading from a strategy perspective, but is also able to be sort of the good operational steward as well. And so that's sort of another theme that's really been coming out for COOs in particular, is around how do you sort of juggle those two tensions? How do you wear those two hats effectively, build the plane while you're flying it, so to speak. So I'll now hand over to Paul, who will talk a little bit more about collaboration more broadly across the sector.
Thanks, Adam. So the second theme within this idea of what does leading across the sector look like is actually working as a sector. And there's two parts to this story that we heard from many COOs around the world. The first one, which I think has been long discussed but rarely implemented well, is actually collaboration between institutions in that back of house concept. And then the more sort of, I guess, spicy topic, which is mergers, consolidations of universities, maybe with, other higher education and tertiary education institutions. And then there's the question of, as leaders in an institution, as COOs, what is the role for professional services leaders in terms of advocating for the sector outside? So whether that's government, whether that's the students, whether that's the industry partners, et cetera, et cetera. So there's sort of these whole sets of leadership roles that professional services leaders are being asked to step into or see the space for them to step into. And so uh, the first one here is really around that shared services and infrastructure. What does it look like for universities to take that seriously? So how do you crack down the barriers and break down the assumptions that universities can't share back offices? Where does it make good sense to do that? Where does it make good sense to go it alone? And I thought there's sort of a fabulous quote on the left-hand side, which I've just shared, which is sort of saying that in lots of ways, institutions from a professional services perspective work in isolation. They have complete teams running payroll. We spend millions around cybersecurity, around infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. I laughed at this electron microscopes and stuff that goes ping. But I think the sense that actually across universities, there's so much good that can be done. And the universities do collaborate in terms of sharing good practice, but we're talking about a more structural sense of what does it look like to go to shared services and shared infrastructure in a really profound way. And there was a real push in this year, I think, more than ever before, to say there's no other way that we can manage these assets if we're not taking these ideas seriously. The second one, which we heard particularly through the UK, but also more and more in Australia, is that readiness and willingness to engage in the conversations around mergers, acquisitions, and consolidations. You'll see the quote, which is really that these aren't being adequately considered. And I think the real insight from this was that even though the talk is at service level, the talk is that these will happen and will happen over the next few years, the depth of thinking, the depth of planning around what are our partners that would be a possibility here, under what terms and conditions and arrangements would make this a good thing for our institution, for our mission, for our students, that's not being thought about. And those kind of arrangements, mergers, consolidations, it can't just be a financial push. It can't just be about improving efficiencies or even reducing competition. It has to be kind of a strategic and a mission-based for it to last. And really, the conversation is the cultural and identity concerns, along with the job security concerns, are really hindering progress and having deep and thoughtful conversations about that. And then I think the last thing is when we talk about working as a sector, more than ever before, COOs are saying, actually, we need to take a public facing role. And in some sense, that's not been true of CEOs often in the past around talking about this. And there's a really interesting quote, I think, here from one of the Australian CEOs that says, have we created this sense of boy who cried wolf scenario where we've complained about every policy change, that we've been loud around this, and now the government and the public maybe don't believe us when something is genuinely going to affect us? And so there's this sense in which if we're going to build credibility, if we're going to build trust, we have to be out there being clear around when things really do affect us, when we have to solve these problems of our own, so that you can build that trust when big, complicated policy or global political or financial challenges happen, that you are seen as a credible voice as a CEO talking to your partners. So that sort of finishes, I guess, pillar one. But Adam, I might
Paul, no,
hand
I was
over
going
to
to say
you.
there is actually a question if you want. I can just read it for you. So, how do you see third-party services playing a role in shared professional services?
So I'll have a go at him, but feel free. I think there is often an assumption that shared services means offshoring or outsourcing. And I actually think in the university environment, there's so much to be gained from having really credible and expert partners, but you see very few universities at the level of maturity where they seriously are thinking about that. So I think third-party services are critical. I think you have to be thoughtful around where that is the right arrangement and the sophistication around how you have the sort of arrangements with those parties so you get the services you want. I think more and more what you're seeing is using those third-party services to be able to say, how, if we've got the same platform, the same arrangements across multiple universities, how do we get the best out of that? How do we work together with those third-party services rather than go it alone in 10 or 15 different instances? Adam, what's your thoughts?
Look, I absolutely agree with you, Paul, and look, we'll touch on it very briefly in the next theme as well. But we've had these conversations around, is it more around sharing across institutions? My very personal view, I'd say this is my personal view, not necessarily company view, is that I think that is very difficult to get those types of arrangements work. We work with a lot of universities that find it difficult enough to get shared services across their faculties, let alone across faculties across multiple institutions. That's not an easy thing to do. And we've seen through Uniforum quite a few universities that have been able to effectively use third-party outsource partners to do this. And if you think about what are you trying to achieve through a shared service model or an outsource model, a lot of that is around sort of building on economies of scale. Those third-party providers are very much incentivized to do that, where you aren't necessarily as an institution. So I think they will play and can play a really important role, not just within institutions, but if you're looking to set up more shared service operations across institutions, is having a third party who is incentivized to run that better could work well.
And thanks for the question. Keep them coming.
Yes, absolutely. So moving on to our third theme, a broader efficiency remit. So look, as we've talked about already and Paul sort of positioned up front, managing the cost base has become a very sort of critical short-term priority for many professional leaders. And the challenge is, as you can see there on the screen, is that how do you then do this without compromising on an institutional's academic mission or the academic and social mission? Like it's becoming an increasingly big challenge for universities. We've not sort of mentioned this before, but I've sort of said before that the assumptions that have sort of driven the growth of universities, or the conditions that have driven the growth of universities over the last 10 years, have changed. And we talk about in Nous here that in Australia, we've moved into more of a managed era, which is characterised by constrained revenues, less autonomy, more regulation, and arguably less sort of influence and power that the universities hold. So this is actually forcing universities. So we've moved from sort of a growth era to more of a managed era. This is forcing universities to make much tougher choices around, what is it they do? Where is it they invest? In recent years, when we sort of talk to universities, we'd always talk to the concept of how do you do more with less? How do you become more productive in what you're doing so you're reinvesting more in your academic mission? It's now the reality is for many institutions, or not, maybe not many, but some institutions, the reality is how do we actually now start to do less with less? That's increasingly being the question that COOs and other leaders within institutions are starting to ask. And we can see that really strongly in the data that you see here on screen. So this is where we asked a question around, how are you thinking about balancing or achieving financial sustainability going forward? And you can see the quite stark results where the revenue levers, so increasing tuition fees, dropped from 43% to 13%. International enrolment expansion dropped by 29%. So quite a stark difference to where we were in 2023, whereas the cost levers have gone up quite a lot. And what you'll really notice there is, yes, you've got improving efficiency on support services, still absolutely number one. But you can also see then that number two, removal of low margin programs. And so this was really sort of the big theme that came through in this particular area with the COOs. Is there's really two parts to this cost challenge. There's the first part, which is the next wave of professional service efficiencies, and then the other is then tackling rising academic costs. So on that first one, so on the professional service efficiencies, so for many universities in Australia, and we do see this when we look at Uniforum results, that Australian universities have really been at the forefront when it has come to sort of changes to their operating model, driving efficiencies through their corporate services. They typically run sort of a more efficient model than we see in sort of global counterparts. So that does sort of then ask the question, so where do we go next? And Paul will be talking a little bit later on the digital side of that, because obviously that has to play a big role going forward. And there's questions around why that hasn't played a large role in driving efficiency. But sort of going to sort of the previous section, this is where we are seeing universities become sort of much more, they're getting much more deliberate in some of their decisions around, do we need to be looking at cutting the number of strategic projects? There's nothing strategic about a list. So what are we actually investing in terms of our key initiatives? We've got increasingly seeing universities talking about reducing service levels or stopping services. I've heard some quite sort of quite surprising ones. There was some universities in the UK that have stopped some services that you wouldn't expect, some very much student-facing services. And also we're seeing more universities talk about things like outsourcing and offshoring than what was happening earlier on. And some of that's also sort of being coupled to a larger sort of conversation around things like transnational education, offshore campuses in a response to some of those constraints imposed by that more managed era and policy environment that we find ourselves in at the moment. The second one, obviously, that I've talked about on screen is then around tackling the rising academic costs. So, academic costs will typically make up at least 50% of the institution's cost base. So when you're talking about sort of structural issues from a finance perspective, that has to be then become part of the conversation and is increasingly becoming part of the conversation. And it's not just, so when you look at this, it's not just necessarily around, okay, this means we're looking to cut academic costs. It's also thinking about the flow-on impact from decisions we make in the academic side that might be driving professional services costs. We ran a COO roundtable in Australia last year, and this was one of the big things that came up, is that there's only so much you can do in improving efficiencies unless you actually start to tackle the root cause. What is driving those, inefficient processes? The number of committees that we have, for example, something like that. And we've recently launched, as many of you would know, we've recently launched a new teaching effort analytics benchmarking program as part of Uniforum. And so we're collecting a lot of data to help universities make better decisions around their teaching models, their workload allocations, their teaching delivery. And we've been able to combine those results with our professional services. And we can actually start to see now some of those impacts of where you see sort of larger, more complex portfolios. What is that doing for things like the amount of support required for enrolments and admissions or timetabling? It's most universities you talk to, the number one student inquiry will typically be students having issues with their timetable. And again, a lot of that's coming back to some fundamental things around the academic side that are increasingly being talked about by COOs and provosts and other leaders. All right, I'll now hand back to Paul, who's going to talk more around the sort of the collaborative effort that universities are needing to go on.
Thanks, Adam. We also had a question come in, and I might throw this one to you. It's another one around, I guess, what that next wave of professional services efficiencies might look like. It says, are Australian universities more progressed in achieving shared services than UK universities, or is it the other way around? And if so, why is this? And then there's sort of, I guess, the second part of this question is it accepted experience that shared services lead to both efficiencies and uplift in service provision? So really, has the business case for shared services been played out in the university context as well?
Yep. So on the first one, yes, Australian universities are typically more progressed on shared services. We see that in our data. More Australian universities have implemented shared services. The reason being that primarily is historically, UK universities have been better funded than Australian institutions. And there's also, so there's sort of that factor. So there hasn't necessarily been the same level of burning platform, if I put it that way. The second part of that as well is that a lot of UK universities, particularly those outside of London, benefit from a lower employment cost, so a lower cost per FTE. So they've been able to deliver a lot of their professional services sort of with higher revenues and then a lower cost base. So which means they've been able to throw more people at the problem. But now, as they've seen that their revenues have started to be constrained as well and drop on a real-term basis, that's where we're now starting to see a lot more UK universities, and a lot of them have done this very successfully, start to transition to more shared service operating models. And when we look at the impact of shared service models, typically they will lead to more efficient and effective services. But there's a big caveat on that, is that to actually achieve that, it's not just about the shared service model. You actually still need to think about the service end to end. So just having a fantastic shared services operation that's completely disconnected from the rest of the institution and how services are delivered will not achieve a more efficient model. But when they're done well, they do often look like, from the data, they will look like the most efficient and effective models.
We're on a roll here with questions, which I adore. There's another one around shared services, which is what are the examples of Australian universities who seem to be doing shared services really well?
Well, do you have some ones that you would name, Paul? Examples of what they're doing well?
Yeah, I think my answer would be that it takes time to do them well. And so what you see is the ones that have moved and progressively worked at this over sort of 8 to 10 years tend to be the ones which are actually driving towards that. I think that the example that I've looked at most recently is Monash, which I think moved to it, and I sort of progressively worked their way through it. I think there's also an example over at Auckland University in New Zealand that I think have thought very intentionally around what's the connection between the faculty or the school structures and that shared services. And to Adam's point, I think the ones that do it really well are thinking about what is the role design within a faculty, within a school that ensures that that connection, that end to end, works into shared services. So you have examples of shared services units that are highly effective, highly efficient, but the best from an institutional perspective is the one where there's very intentional design around everyone that's connecting into those shared services units, not just the back of house job. I think there's also, and I think it's hard to sort of name across a whole portfolio, but the ones that have focused on the real transactional, high volume, high touch ones first, and use that to sort of drive the automation and make the most of their systems, tend to be the ones that are achieving sort of institutional outcomes rather than taking on the very complex processes at the start and sort of getting bogged down.
Yeah.
Adam, what's your sense?
No, look, I would absolutely agree with that. There are a couple, and there's a few other great examples as well. Many of you are probably aware of the work that Macquarie University have done quite recently, and very much picking up on a lot of the aspects that Paul just talked about in terms of setting up a really good high functioning shared services operating model. There's also another question that's just come in. What changes are universities thinking about in academic processes that might deliver reduced costs in professional services? And what are they not thinking about yet? So I think in terms of the ones that we are seeing a lot more universities talk about things like simplifying the architecture of their programs and their units and courses. So that's been a big issue. So looking at things like reducing the number of prereqs and these sorts of things, it creates a lot of flow-on issues when it comes to admissions, enrollments, timetabling, etc. So that's sort of a big one. Another one that we are seeing is sort of more on the pedagogical side. Universities are now increasingly looking at the level and nature of their assessments, because that again does push a lot of effort back into the professional services side of the university. So I think that's probably another one which is both we're seeing universities go there, but probably not enough yet. There's quite a lot of scope to go in that assessment. It's only very much embryonic from that perspective. And then probably the other one where we're seeing universities talking is probably in the so around the sort of the course and unit, using different terms for these, program, subject, whatever your favorite term is in your institution, the sort of development, quality assurance, and renewal processes. Those can often be very large, drawn out. So I think institutions are now sort of looking more at those again and around, what is the right amount of quality assurance? How are we making sure that we're better managing how new courses and subjects are being created? Because that, again, a lot of that can drive sort of a lot of cost on the professional services, but also create a lot of cost on the academic side as well.
Yeah, and then I think to the second half around, what are they not thinking about? To me, a lot of what's not being thought about is what does the end-to-end process look like there. So Adam used some very good examples around assessment, but really thinking about how do you use sort of really highly automatable, simple, high quality processes that get all the way from, marking of assessments through to sharing our results, right? That whole journey and really connecting all the dots rather than hitting one specific process or one specific pain point at a time. I think the second one that's probably not being thought really carefully around is the whole space of research services support centrally. And really, there's so much complexity in there and regulatory and ethics. But I think there's an enormous effort in order to make that experience so much simpler, so much smoother, so the researchers can sort of self-service most of the time, but also that the back end is really chewing through. I think there's an enormous opportunity to really look carefully around research service support and the systems there in a way that probably is 10 or 15 years behind where something that's sort of a core corporate service has been looked at in universities. So I'll move on to theme 4, And this is really around collaboration by default. This is often the most fun part of our conversations when we talk to COOs, which is really, how are you helping others achieve their goals, and how are they helping you achieve their goals, and how are you working across portfolios in order to achieve these changes that you hope for. I think this year has been a really interesting conversation, and there's sort of three quotes here, and I'll call out a couple of things. One is that professional service leaders are saying it's actually our job to keep the academic side of the house uncomfortable with the pace of change that's required. That actually we should be pushing the pace of innovation, the pace of adaptation, the pace of change. Given what we understand about the institutional finances, the position that we're in, we need our institutions to learn to move faster. And so that's sort of the first quote, which I think is very good. It's that sense in which one of the roles of the CEO, one of the roles of professional services leaders, is actually to push the envelope so that people start feeling a bit uncomfortable with how much things are changing. And that's part of what being a good collaborator, being a good partner is to other portfolios. The second one is this understanding that when that goes wrong, what COOs are feeling is that they're being used as the sort of unreasonable COO, that they're the ones delivering the bad news to the community, or the bad news to the board, or the bad news to the deans. And then actually in cost-constrained environments, while of course academic colleagues understand and recognize that, do they deeply understand how much change is required to structurally solve this problem? And so I think there's these two sides. It's helpful to the provost, is sort of the quote, who plays the academic side, but behind the scenes, there has to be this sense in which everyone needs to be united in presenting what this really looks like. Otherwise, CEOs feel a bit exposed as they're the bad guys, sort of doing the budget cuts, when in fact what we need is a collective leadership moving the institution forward. And the last one, I think, is something we hear every time we talk to COOs, and I think it's a really important point, which is, how are you the partner to the academic leadership? So how are you lockstep? And we've heard it more and more, I think, post-COVID, which is actually that personal relationship with the provost in particular, if that's how the arrangement is, but that there's that real co-leadership between professional and academic leaders on everything. The default plan for when you're changing things is that you need academic leadership and professional services leadership to be working hand in glove. And I'll ask Adam for a comment on that next. But what I do want to share is this piece of data. And when we first put this report together, we kind of had highlighted that cross-portfolio collaboration going up compared to previous years, but we hadn't kind of really noticed, I think, how much it had shifted away from the highest role priorities for the professional services leaders was dropping away from strategy. And what you see is that's quite a substantial drop away. And the question was asked when we did a roundtable of CEOs recently: is that a problem for us? Are we so busy trying to sort of work with our colleagues, work with the institutions, explain to everyone the position we're in, that we're actually not putting in the time or the focus to sit back and say, so what's the strategy to get out of this? Are we too short-termist in this? And I think it is an important reflection that when you have these kind of financial challenges and you're really up against the precipice, there is an enormous motivation to go short-term. But as Adam talked about right at the start of this session, actually the structural changes, the long-term changes needed for financial stability require COOs and their leadership teams to sit down and plan this out carefully. What are the investments? What are the changes that are going to last 10, 15 years, not just balance the books in 1 or 2 or 3? Okay, so speaking of long-term strategic challenges, Adam, I'll hand over to you for our fifth topic around managing the aging assets of universities.
Thank you, Paul. So look, as you would all obviously know, many universities are sitting on large, aging and often underutilized assets across their campus footprint. These assets they're costly to maintain, and as I said, no longer fit for purpose, especially when we talk about things like how students are wanting to engage with the physical campus, how teaching methods are evolving, how hybrid work trends are evolving as well. So this is a big challenge that universities are facing globally, not just here in Australia. But what's become more acute this year when we looked at the survey results is that increasingly universities are now needing to make, again, sort of big choices around where are they actually investing or not. And so particularly when you talk about CapEx investment, the choice is now becoming between the digital environment and the physical environment, and the physical environment's losing. And you see that again quite starkly in the results here. So the headline figure, as you can see, is 54% of universities have reduced capital investments in the last 12 months. And you can see, if you look at some of the circles there, we've got significantly reduced is up from 5% in 2023 to 25%. And then you've got minimally reduced from 9% to 31%. So it's a very significant shift that we're seeing here. So, capital budgets are under a lot of pressure. But the problem with that, obviously, is the underlying issues don't go away just because you stop spending. So that was sort of the first of a couple of sub-themes, if you will, that came out. So we do see capital budgets being under a lot more pressure. As you can see from the quote there from a COO at Australian University, once you've sort of ticked off the things around travel and learning and development, estate management is always sort of the next thing that comes up in the line. But the problem, obviously, when you start to tighten budgets around CapEx is it's basically sort of squeezing one end of a balloon and the problem appears somewhere else. So this is when we start to see issues around deferred maintenance, or your CapEx starts to become then increasing OpEx costs. So you start to see, increases in your cleaning and maintenance bills. I was actually at and this sort of comes to the next point around assets not being fit for purpose. I was at a UK university recently doing a campus tour, and they pointed out a building. And they said, look at this building here. We've basically just closed the entire thing because the cladding on the building was starting to fall off. It has asbestos all through it. It's built in a way that is not easily configurable to actually change the way that spaces can be used. So they just basically had to mothball the building. That was effectively the best thing that they could do. And this is a big challenge that we're seeing, and it's particularly what's interesting is when you look at the building stock or the assets across universities, it'll typically be those assets that are built in the 60s and 70s that are the ones that are the most expensive to maintain. So we hear this from particularly again UK universities, but universities here in Australia as well. The old sandstone universities, they're built quite robust. Obviously, new buildings are getting built to standard. It's the ones that were built through that sort of 60s through to 80s period where we're seeing these large deferred maintenance builds. We're seeing buildings have to be decommissioned. We're seeing increased operational costs as well. And there's lots of different things driving that. I've talked about these buildings being, inflexible, unsafe, but then also inefficient from a sustainability perspective, which is also sort of driving a part of the cost as well. The other thing, though, that was quite interesting that came through a lot of the conversations with CEOs as well is this idea of ROI, however, becoming a much bigger focus. So we've always talked about, assets, buildings on universities' campus being underutilized. That continues to be an issue, but this is forcing professional leaders to start to think a little bit more differently around how do they improve the ROI on their buildings? How do they improve things like the utilization, and start to look at new different ways? So look at new revenue channels, look at student accommodations, retail, commercial income. And I should say this is something that Australian universities have been doing for quite some time. Like if you sort of look across the large capital expenditures of universities in Australia for the last 5, even 10 years, you'll see a lot of those buildings were not just getting built as a sort of a single mode type building, just a teaching building. They are buildings that have had multiple purposes. So this has been something that universities are talking more about, but it has been a trend that's been happening for quite a few years. So that's the physical assets. I'll now hand over to Paul to talk about, I think, our last theme, which is the digital assets.
Thanks, Adam. And Adam and I have sort of artificially split this into physical and digital, but as you'll all know, I mean, the hybrid's here to stay, and a lot of these conversations cross across both that idea of the kind of multi-purpose facility, but also that idea of multi-purpose tech being able to be used, reused in order to create both the physical and digital spaces for students and researchers and the institution to run. A couple of interesting observations here. This was the first time in the last 5 years where really digital investment was mostly flat from COOs. So there was an enormous sort of demand in sort of 2021 into 2022 to say hybrids here. We've got to spend big on physical. We've also got to spend big on digital. We've got to create these hybrid campuses. The second report was really then pulling a bit back off of the campus physical infrastructure and still going hard at digital. This time, what we're seeing is digital investments are mostly flat. That doesn't mean they're not a significant priority, but the dollars aren't there. And the other interesting part about this, I think, and I'll move us forward, is that a lot of the CEOs we talk to are very skeptical about the impact of those digital investments over the last 10 years. That's not to say that they weren't necessary, but in the sense to say that the business case was saying this was going to push efficiency, this was going to push productivity. And in this context, professional services leaders have kind of said, well, that didn't really happen. In fact, what happened was that we were just sort of keeping up. It was just sort of a necessary investment to move the institution forward. And so they didn't achieve the kind of changes that they expected. And some CEOs, and I think there's a quote here, even went as far to say, we're now just not going to ask for or expect those kind of productivity efficiency changes from these digital investments because they just don't occur in universities, which I think is a pretty stark sort of place to be in when you think that there's this next wave of professional services changes that are going to happen. Universities are in a real challenge in terms of financially, and they're saying that these major digital investments aren't delivering the kind of productivity and efficiency that we expected or needed. So that skepticism is real. And I think that's not unique to universities, but there are some elements as to why universities might not be capturing those kind of efficiencies. The second thing really, I think, in this conversation was moving into, okay, if that's true of your previous investments, what changes going forward? And I thought this was a really interesting piece of data from the survey respondents. And what we talked about, we've asked this over all three. On the left-hand side in the blue is how COOs talked about the most important enablers over the next 5 to 10 years. And so what you can see is improving that on-campus experience, innovating around the program offer, and that's sort of new and interesting things, and improving the online student experience. So real classic set of conversations around sort of how do we better serve students? How do we better engage? How do we grow? What you'll see in the 2025 is very different. You see that sort of improving the campus experience has tanked. You'll see that innovating around the program office has also dropped off. And as Adam noted earlier, actually the focus around the program is now around program rationalization, consolidation, thinking about, what's the best program offer that we can run efficiently, and improving the online student experience has actually dropped way down the list. And what you see is three different things that have emerged, and they're in that bottom right. And I'll do them in sort of, I guess, reverse order, right? One is expanding T&E, and this is obviously a response to the kind of global challenges around international students, and particularly being able to service students offshore rather than have onshore international students. And so that's a real revenue diversification play. You then see leveraging AI and automation. We didn't ask this previously, but with the sort of, I think, ubiquitous conversation around Gen AI, we asked the question, and really that's now sort of 2 on the list of the most important enablers over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that's spot on. The potential here to get it right is married by people who are skeptical around what this is going to look like. And what you see is actually that administrative service efficiency is at the top of the list now. So you can see a real cost-constrained environment, a real look at revenue diversification outside of the classic choices, and this sense in which we do still need the digital, we do still need the tech to be able to drive this forward, but we've got this new set of tools that potentially we're looking to in order to take us to the next level. And so then Adam and I will ask questions, so please jump in and ask a whole lot. I can see there's a couple in our queue already, but what I'll just do is just sort of cover it off. I think the major takeaway I take from this report is universities are navigating this unprecedented period, as Adam said, the second unprecedented period in 5 years. And it is really threatening the viability of some institutions. I mean, this is not, oh, we're 3 years away from it. This is a sort of here and now financial pressure. And so those tailwinds that took universities into COVID are now very much headwinds. And universities are facing very difficult decisions around what they can and can't afford to do, both immediately and also the pressure on what that means going forward. this really does require, I think, COOs and leadership teams to be thinking very carefully around what is the decisive action we need to make on those immediate pressures. And then also, what does the longer term horizon look like? Will it require more fundamental reconsiderations of the value of universities? What do the operating models to deliver that value look like? And how do we set ourselves up to be ready for that? So there's not going to be all these solutions that are within the purview of professional services leaders, of course. However, I think as we continuously discuss this with COOs, they play a critical role alongside their academic colleagues in guiding the institution through this period of uncertainty, while also maintaining that core commitment to the academic and social missions of the institution. And so really, COOs and their teams are talking about these, right? How do we steer the ship? So how do we lift the understanding of the financial position that universities are in so that everyone understands it and we can make good management decisions? How do we work better as a sector, both behind the scenes in our back office shared services? How do we think carefully around what mergers and consolidations might look like? And how do CEOs start being a more public facing entity in talking about the position that universities are in? How do we better manage those resources so that next wave of professional services efficiencies, and also supporting on the academic side to make sure that delivery of teaching and research is aligned with what the institutions can do? And in that, then partnering well with academic colleagues to achieve these kind of structural reforms. And then lastly, the conversation around where do the big investments go? Managing those aging assets, repurposing them for the future, and also thinking about what does it mean to ensure that universities have that digital edge? How do they lead? How do universities lead and advocate for these digital investments? And also, how do they learn to play, I guess, both offense and defense with AI? So save costs, but also innovate and create great new experiences for their students, for their staff. And so while this current operating environment is very challenging, it also presents these series of opportunities to deliver the structural changes to the way universities operate and to manage those scarce resources to ensure success long term. Okay, so thanks for joining us. Adam and I are going to sort of turn our attention to the Q&A now. And I think that means if we can successfully do it, Adam, we're going to bring down this presentation. And so the first one, and I'll throw it to you, Adam, is reproductivity improvements and system changes. Do you think we're just not trying hard enough to quantify and realize the benefits? That is, there is a temporary increased workload through implementation, but then we should be able to rebalance the workforce over time. And I think this probably goes to a question that Adam and I talk about, which is this a university thing, not being able to achieve these benefits from sort of system changes, et cetera, et cetera? What is it that allows institutions, organizations to actually capture the benefits that are promised of these systems?
Yeah. Look, absolutely. As a person who runs a business called Nous Data Insights, there's always a better way to be measuring things, of course, and more data. But I would say, look, it goes back to, in terms of rebalancing the workforce over time, you're absolutely right that when we look at transformation programs that have occurred, typically you will see a sort of a rise in workforce FTEs, or a rise in capacity during the transformation process to enable to enable you to move from current to future state. We often do see that. You can't always do that. Sometimes universities, given cost constraints, will just need to move straight to the future state, and that can be quite painful. But that's often a necessity if you're doing it in a time when you're under financial pressure as well. I think the problem, it's not necessarily around, it's not always, I think, about just sort of quantifying and realizing the benefits. It's also that there's a reality that when you do a transformation, to actually drive to correct the step change in sort of productivity improvements, you do need to also address the work that's getting done. And I think this sort of goes back to some of the points that Paul was making when talking with digitally, is that universities will often do maybe the structural changes, they'll do implement the digital systems, but then the ongoing work, actually looking at the process work to actually simplify and reduce the actual tasks involved, that work doesn't often get done. That work actually often increases. So any of those benefits are still taken up by either inefficient processes or more work that's created within the institution. So I think there is a bit of discipline that when you're going through these types of large transformations, yes, you should be absolutely sort of tracking the benefits and sort of holding yourself to account, but you need to continue that process, that continuous improvement process to actually drive the work down if you are wanting to achieve, the long-term productivity improvements.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Adam. I guess the sentiment when we do reviews sort of post these large system changes is that we either didn't change the roles that are interacting with these systems in a way that they're now specialized and we can train and we can focus on those roles well. And so there's, 500, 800 people accessing this system that is actually was built and designed to have 50 or 80. And the second one is that we're not actually really intentional around saying, let's build the better process rather than just automate this existing crap process. And so what you have is this kind of systemization of poor processes with many, many people accessing these processes. And so yes, it's in the system, but it's not actually, the goal was to reimagine what that process could look like with the technology. And that means different roles, different skill sets, different training. And I think universities are poor at being brave enough to say, we'll move from everyone who is out in schools and faculties being able to access and input into this to actually we're going to have to have one role in this area. They're going to be expert. They're going to be the place. And so the quality of information going into the system, the expertise, the skills are very different to today. And so I think you do see a lot of complex, unnecessary processes being systematized rather than changing the way that people interact with these systems in order to achieve the outcome that's required.
And two sort of further sort of anecdotes off the top of that, we had a roundtable recently which sort of touched on some of this issue. We were speaking to, there was a software vendor there that was presenting, and they were saying that customization within your digital systems is the absolute killer of efficiency, because they're now at a point where they will push out many multiple updates to their software within a day, not just sort of in a month or 6 month period. So if you've heavily customized your software, your digital platforms, and they're pushing out these updates daily, multiple updates daily, that creates a huge amount of overhead for the institution as well, which often is why you don't sort of see big changes in the digital workforce or the IT workforce when you do these large transformations. But the other point, just building on what you said as well, Paul, is we had a CIO roundtable, I mentioned it earlier last year, and one of the biggest challenges they said is that universities typically don't go far enough in embedding the new ways of practice and stopping the old ways of practice and not allowing shadow workforces to continue or allowing people to have sort of systems that work around the core systems. And again, that's another area where you see the benefits not being realized, because we're not saying, no, this is the way that we now need to operate going forward, and holding to that.
Yeah, I think there's a really good comment from someone. I don't think the rest of you can see it, but I can see it, which is that often the sort of the large systems transformation programs will focus on a single system, a new CRM, a new student management system. But the efficiencies aren't realized because of those other systems sitting around not being well integrated. And those are the systems that teams are using. They're often the ones that are very bespoke. They're often the ones that are very specialized, and they weren't uplifted or improved. So you kind of have the big new shiny thing, but actually a lot of the work, a lot of the input into that is these much smaller systems, which are very bespoke, which teams really use. And I think that's a very good observation, and I think it is a real challenge with kind of doing a systems first transformation rather than saying, what's the outcome we're trying to achieve here, how does it work today, what would it really look like if we could use our systems to do a lot of that heavy lifting. And then you're not talking about what we're doing is replacing student management system. What we're doing is actually changing the way we do major process X, and that involves 6 or 7 systems that we're going to talk to each other. We can do this very differently if we kind of actually thought carefully around this. So thanks for that comment. I think that's spot on. I think this is another comment, but I actually think it's a really good one, Adam, for you to comment on, which is higher education has a divided focus: learning and teaching innovation spend versus professional services team systems. And I'll make an observation, then throw it to Adam. But I think that's true of any institution, right? You have your product, you have your service, you have what you offer to the market. You then have to run a large, complex institution. Most universities are nearing on the $1 billion or up or down. I think that's not a unique problem for universities, but I agree. Universities do an enormously diverse range of things across their research engagement, their teaching, and it is an incredibly complex business operation. But I do think that being able to sort of separate how do we run internally as efficiently and well as possible, and then how do we actually deliver the experience of what we offer out to the world well, does split professional services teams' time and the systems required to deliver on them.
Yeah. Look, I'll keep my answer reasonably short just because I know we're just about out of time, but I would agree with the comment, but also say that that shouldn't be the case, right? It shouldn't be that it's a divided focus. How you're innovating on your learning and teaching side should be aligned to and aligned with what you're doing on your professional services side, right? Like those two should be a mutually reinforcing activity. So you're designing your professional services to support how it is you want to be doing your learning and teaching. And I think where we see the most we've always said this, that the best way to achieve a more sustainable, efficient service is to start with the effectiveness of that service. If you start there, that will drive long-term efficiencies. If you try and just tackle it as an efficiency-based problem, then that's where you'll typically end up taking costs out that will then come back in, because it hasn't been designed with sort of the service user and the end goal in mind.
Thank you, everyone. We've just hit time. And so just a reminder that we'll be sending you the recording of this. So if you are willing to listen to it again, I'm sure Adam and I would appreciate that. We'll also send you a link to download the report if you haven't had a chance to read it, or if you have a plane ride coming up that you want to spend some time reading it, we would love that. You should get both of those in the next day or so. So thank you so much. We really appreciate the chance to speak with you all and present our work, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.